And so that sort of opens the door for a lot of topics, which you'll see today, as we're going to start with a very controversial topic, and one that I was discussing recently with Billy Ray on Infinite Fringe. Now, if you're not new to the alternative community, then I'm sure that this is something that um, oh, you've maybe heard of, discussed before, but maybe if you're not a musician, or even if you are a musician, maybe it's never quite made sense. It's a topic you've heard of, but haven't quite really comprehended. And it's something that I intend to explore in detail over the coming months. It's research that I really just started. And this is so funny because this is exactly. I just have to share something that's happening over here. I made notes for this talk that we're about to do. And as I'm opening it, technology always tends to be a little bit tricky for me in situations. Like, things happen to me through technology that nobody would believe. And they're always like, oh, it's just you. But somehow, maybe it is just me, I turned my document into, I believe it's Arabic, which I don't speak. I didn't even think that was an option to do on my iPad. It's rather incredible. So I'm going to just work from the short version that I have. And like I said, it's a topic that we're going to expand on each week, or maybe every other week, as I'm doing ongoing investigation in this. And I really want to invite anybody listening today that hears this, that if there's something that you can add to the discussion or correct me on, please, because I'm really just engendering the conversation and exploring it from my own perspective. And I recognize that, there's really a lot out there that might not even be accessible on the internet anymore that maybe was before. And I'm mainly using the internet at this point to do my research. So there could be some limitations, some skewing here. Certainly most of the articles that I read were discounting this. And what are we talking about? Well, it's a very common notion in the truth community that the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, ordered in 1939 to replace all the tuning forks with 440 hertz. Okay. The story is that he proposed this world standard of tuning A above middle C to 440. Now, why did he do this? The most common explanation is that he was weaponizing music, and he was creating a war on consciousness by using this certain frequency that causes disease and destruction in the human body and mind. So before we get into whether or not this claim is true, I want to explain a little bit about what we're talking about, because even if you are a musician, you might not have studied about tuning, or you don't need to know about the physics of sound in order to be a musician. So I'd like to explain it as if you don't know anything about it, for anyone who would like this to be clear. From the physics of sound, we study sound waves through hertz, which are cycles per second. This is how we measure all electromagnetic waves, and sound waves are a certain portion of electromagnetic waves. Okay? So when we are talking about tuning, what we've been doing for many centuries now is taking the A above middle C and tuning it to a specific frequency. And then there has been different types of tuning methods, but in the current equal temperament, what we've done is we've taken that 440, let's say it's 440 hertz on A, and then we've created the notes in the intervals from that one. So that's sort of like a relative pitch way of doing it, right? So that A isn't where that 440 is important, because then mathematically speaking, it's creating the other numbers. It's creating the mathematics from there. And before this 1939 standardization that happened, that did indeed happen. The question that we're going to talk today is whether or not this really came from the Nazis, but it did indeed become the standard in 1939, that 440 became the hertz that we used for that A, and then we tuned everything off of that. Now, before that, it could have been anywhere from 415 hertz to 450 hertz. Okay. And when I looked up on a chart today, because I've had the question, like, how many hertz constitutes, one note before it moves up a half step, before it's shifted to, let's say, A sharp, right? Or goes down to A flat. And I saw a range today from about 415 to 466. Anywhere in there would be considered A. Once you get above that, like 470, now you're talking about A sharp. And if you get below, like, let's say 414, then technically you're speaking of A flat or G sharp. Okay. So that's the range for a note. It's a lot of hertz. And can the ear hear this? Yes, it can hear it. And depending on how good of hearing you have for music, which certainly gets better the more that you're attempting to listen and identify notes, then you're very sensitive to it. But for our purposes, let's consider that all of those, that whole range is A. And before a certain point, they were just using their ears to do it before hertz. But we'll get into that history a little bit later. So let's just say, to bring you up to speed, there was a range before this point, before 439. Like, for example, I think the standard in France in the late 1800s might have been 435. Okay. And another, I think I've heard of 432. So this is what I'm reading online. I'm not hearing so much that there was a standardized 432 or 444, even though it might have been proposed by an individual composer, but there was also more freedom and it was being used for specific reasons. Okay. So suddenly there's this range, right? You could hear an A tuned anywhere between 415 and 450, most likely. And suddenly in 439, there was a standardization that happened, and it was that 440 was it. Okay. Why did he do this? This is the question. And many people believe that it was to create a monopolization of the music industry by imposing this frequency. It herded populations into greater aggression, psychosocial agitation, and emotional distress, predisposing people to physical illness and financial imposition, profiting the agents, agencies, and companies engaged in the monopoly. So that was from Leonard Horowitz, which Billy Ray talked to me about, and I've since done a lot of studying. And he is a big voice in the alternative community on this topic. So, hey, that's what a lot of people feel like happened, right? So just think about it. If it is true, most of us that are listening to this, we have only ever heard music at 440, because since that time, the music that we listen to is for the most part 440. It is been tuned to this certain frequency, and that's all that we've been hearing. So it's interesting to think that, like, we've been listening to a dystopian version of music our whole lives, no matter what, right? And many people would say that rock and roll was the devil's music, right? As it proceeded from there, many people would say that there was a devaluation, a de-evolution of music from that point. And you could argue that. I could possibly argue that, to be honest with you. But for me, growing up, this music was great. I loved it. I've had many spiritual experiences listening to music. So it's interesting to think that, number one, music is that incredible that maybe it still can bring, incredible experiences even in this dystopian version, if this is the truth. But also that's all we've known. And I do see that as a metaphor, something that's difficult to swallow, but something that intuitively I think I felt that there's many things that we've never really experienced that humans are meant to experience, and the true power of music is possibly one of them. This could have been co-opted before any of us were born, and it's become so the norm, and music is so much about repetition that it doesn't feel that way to us per se, but that we wouldn't know the difference either, right? Same thing as if we're drinking poison water, or there's things in our water that aren't good for us. We wouldn't necessarily know that. We wouldn't necessarily feel the difference. We wouldn't even recognize in our bodies the difference, the way it would feel if we were drinking from pure water as opposed to tainted water. So I think that's an interesting metaphor that comes up straight away with this notion, and something that resonates for me, because people claim that there's things that can be done with music that I believe that they can, though I have no proof. For example, healing, like truly healing, restoring health, enhancing cognitive abilities. Imagine truly powerful music being played to children, live music being played to children as they're growing, and what that would do to their bodies and their minds and their development. Already, when children learn instruments, it does a lot for their cognition, connecting the two sides of their brain. It does already amazing things. And it's just amazing to me to think that it's even more. It's even more than we can imagine at this point. So is it true then? Did the Nazi minister of propaganda really ruin music before we were born? Has the music we've been listening to, from Beatles to Madonna, has it really just been weapons for our own destruction? I mean, if this were true, little thought experiment here, if it were true, what would that look like? Now that we're looking, 80 years later from that standardization, or about there, what would that look like in a society? I mean, would it mean maybe that we have endless wars? Would it possibly mean that we lose our moral compass? Would things like prioritize material success over family connection, would that become commonplace? And would these important family bonds be replaced by like soulless technology? I don't know, like fleshly addictions such as video games, drug abuse, obesity. Would all these things be widespread? Would it become commonplace to have an infinite growth that really doesn't take into account the natural balance we need with nature? Would common sense, become a rare genius, a rare form of genius? When you look at where society is, I think this is part of the reason that this is widely spread on the internet, because it's almost like we need this type of a theory to explain just how we've ended up where we are. And I think it's very possible that it's part of the picture. But the truth is, so far, I have not been able to find the smoking gun that says that that the Nazis did this on purpose, that it was definitely them, that this was all part of a Nazi plan. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not out there. And like I said, if anybody's come across that, I'd really love to see it. But for the most part, it's just not quite that simple, like many things in history. And I think it's important in the truth community to not proclaim things as fact if we don't have evidence for them. So this is mainly a theory at this point. Now, what do we know? What are the facts that we do know? Well, we do know that 440 Hertz didn't start with the Nazis. We know that it was proposed by a Prussian, Johann Heinrich Schreiber. I don't really speak German, so I'm not sure that that's correct, but he invented the tonometer in the early 1800s, and this was a means of measuring absolute pitch. Before this, it was all done by ear, and I'm sure their ears were exquisite, actually. I don't doubt that they were able to tune to exactly what they wanted. But we really didn't have this Hertz system or this exact measuring of the notes until he came around. And he was the one who theorized on 440, according to the research I've been looking at. So 440 was first proposed all the way back in 1834 at the Stuttgart Convention, then again at the Vienna Conference in 1885, then again in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, before its most famous adoption in the 1939 International Conference in London, of which I've been speaking of. Okay, now Goebbels was not, the minister of propaganda was not at this conference. We know that. There were 3 Germans. And is it possible that he just told them what to do and they went there? Yes, but it's a little different than some of the stories that are told, like he's the one who persuaded it. And it's also a little bit hard to believe it was only from the Germans, because it was unanimously voted. So if it was really being pushed by them, they're about to go on the verge of war, why would they want to adopt something like that? I'm not sure. There's some questions about it. If there is any actual evidence. But for the most part, as far as the standardization, it looked like a collaboration, and it looks like it was something that had been coming, had been a long time in coming. So that's how we ended up with 440. Now, some people say that there's 2 very practical reasons that we went to 440. The first one was that all through the 1800s, the pitch had been being pushed up on A. It had originally been down maybe more around 420, 415. But as they started playing in bigger rooms pushing the pitch up, it started to create like a bigger sound that filled the room. And this is what's interesting about sound and pitch when you get into producing, dealing with how you can make a note sound bigger or louder, but it's not actually volume, and how we can fill a room more with a brighter sound, but it's still the same pitch. It's really incredible, the precision that you can get to expression with music. So they were playing in bigger rooms in the 1800s. They weren't these small little chamber rooms. And because of that, they wanted the sound to fill. So pushing that hertz up made it fill the room better. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason was that you were starting to, let me go back. There's, as they were doing this, before I go to the second reason, let me explain that as they were doing this, many of the singers were having strained voices. So there was sort of a compromise at 440. Like 440 is still filling the room, but it's not pushing it all the way up, which is straining these singers' voices. And supposedly Vivaldi was a big proponent of that because he was so vocal. And this is one of the reasons that Vivaldi was pushing 432. Some people say, not necessarily because of some of the amazing implications of 42, which we will get to shortly. So 440 was like a compromise that a lot of people were making, and it was also going to be a nice standardization because there was more and more radio broadcasting happening from the early 1900s, through this 1939, and so having a standard pitch also made sense for that reason. So 440 was kind of the obvious choice. This is the argument, the counter argument that's made, and you really can't, dispute that either. I mean, those are logical reasons to do it, but was that the only reason? It's when as much as many people have really researched about things behind the scenes, then it is easy to think that it was more than just that. What am I referring to? Well, there is a lot of evidence to show that the Nazis were doing all kinds of experiments trying to figure out how to use music as a weapon. That is a fact. And that is something that I'm going to get into in another discussion on a different upcoming podcast. So that is for sure. And it wasn't just the Germans, right? A lot of different alphabet agencies, and many also say the Rockefellers, which I'm about to also do some deep diving into how true those claims are. But from what I'm seeing on the surface, there is documentation that they were as well by this 1939 point. So that means that you can't be completely naive about this either and act like, oh, it's just because of these very, benign reasons that 440 came about, when there is a lot of evidence that the power of music was known by the Nazis and known by these power players at the time. And there's definite evidence now that, 80 years later, they know a lot more about that. And recently, if you've seen that movie, Leave the World Behind, there is deadly radiation that's released through a sonic sound. And I've heard claims, which I cannot refute or I cannot deny and I cannot promote as true, but I'm just saying that I've heard some legitimate talking or in detail talking that there's even codes put in the movie itself, that they've gotten to the ability of being able to play with frequency on such a level that it can be embedded. And this is also something that I've studied and seen as being true, that they're embedding frequencies, embedding things in music even since the 1960s. And they're not positive things. Now, I'm sure you can use it the other direction. It's something that I would like to do with my music more from a pure intention place, because I believe that it can go the other way. But there's absolute evidence that it's been used the opposite direction in putting things in music that creates a frequency that disturbs people, makes them feel unwell, um, makes you paranoid, maybe all kinds. It can have many different reactions because the studies show that it can be subjective, but there have been many studies done. That part is for sure. Um, the other thing that maybe you've heard of, these are just a few other examples. In Iraq, there was a weapon used that I believe confused some soldiers on the Iraqi side, I believe, and they surrendered immediately. There's a story out of Cuba using some sonic weapons. This was way back when. And that's not even to bring into account many of the connections that have been made between musicians and the military industrial complex in this country alone. Um, uh, that's something that I want to delve into. There's some really great music research that's been done on that. And many of you are probably are all aware of that, but that plays into the same place that even if it's not specifically true that the Nazis changed it to 440 frequency, or we don't have the evidence, we do have enough evidence to suggest that music has been used against us in many different ways, maybe if not all music, much of the music that we've been listening to. And it wouldn't really be that crazy to think that it was based in a frequency that would promote those agendas, that this 440 frequency, sort of creates disharmony in human beings that then makes them more easily programmed, more easily manipulated, just less healthy of human beings, all kinds of things, exactly like what the theories are saying. So that's sort of the full circle that I want to come with that though we don't have specific evidence, or I can't present that specific evidence today, a lot of what you'll see when it's refuting that, it makes it just like, oh, of course it's music is, that's such a silly claim, but it's really not a silly claim when you look at many of the other things that have happened in the last 80 years. So it's something that I'm going to continue researching. I hope others will just at least be aware of the fact that our music might have been messed with on that fundamental of a level. And it's one of the main reasons why I'm looking to inspire people to pick their instruments up and take music back, right? Because the music that you're listening to, is it uplifting you? Is it, helping you to become the best version of yourself? You might say, well, I like the music. It's great. But the truth is, psychologically, it's almost like Stockholm syndrome. Music is about repetition. It could be the worst piece of music you've ever heard, but if you hear enough, you'll like it, or you'll at least connect with it. And then 30 years later, you'll be nostalgic about it. It's just the nature of music. It's that incredible of a thing that if with enough repetition, it'll go right in. And you know this with jingles on TV, bad commercials, bad songs. And in many ways, that's what's happened. I mean, if you're in your teenage years and you're listening to, I don't know, Britney Spears, and she's coming along for the ride as you're growing up and you're going through these rite of passages, well, you will think it's great music, right? And that's not really what we're talking about. Because that's an emotional and a psychological connection. And that's exactly the insidiousness of it. If that's being used against you, getting you to relate to music that in reality isn't the best, most uplifting message for you. It's not the most empowering, but you're letting it go boop right in, right into your subconscious. So it's about programming. And